I was rummaging around in the old attic, and I found this trunk that I managed to get the padlock off, and it had this old notebook in it. I mean, you can see it's obviously a child's notebook, isn't it? I mean, look at the cute little face, And I looked inside, and you're not going to believe this. It's actually one of my notebooks from when I was a little boy, and I was a very imaginative boy at the time. I had dreams bigger than perhaps many other children my age did. And a very unique sort of sense of poignant things to say. And so let's see you see it's for drawing and for writing. So let's see what I actually, what did I put down? Was there anything in there that we need to know today? Let's have a look. Oh, well, here we go. So actually it says esports pools has live in-play betting. Duncan, age 6. So, I mean, kind of crazy actually if you think about it. I mean, rather prescient to know that 28 years later, I'd be sponsored by esports pools, which actually obviously didn't even exist at the time by a span of probably 27, 26 years or something. So, from the mouths of babes, Now, we're going to get into some nerd shit because we're going to talk about some format aspects. And obviously for nerd shit, need the old stereotypes, right, don't we? Just get the old pocket protector on there. No. So the Blast Pro Series tournament took place in Denmark not so long ago. And one of the most controversial aspects of it was the format. Now, the reason why this is a little bit bizarre to me is that there are many tournaments currently present in the current year, 2017, and throughout all of esports history that have had bad, confusing, just somewhat pointless formats at times, and yet people eat up these events. They rarely ever complain. Like, for example, I actually think if you go and you look at the format of ECS, I'm actually a little bit shocked it never gets any sort of criticism for this format, because they have best of ones for the winners match and the first match, and then they have best of threes for the lower bracket. And then, because they only invite 8 teams based on where you place, top 4 NA, top 4 EU, you go directly to the semi-finals. And so you get bizarre scenarios like where Cloud9 at the last DCS won 2 best of ones and then instantly were top 4 at the event, got utterly smashed by FaZe, at least overall. I mean, they didn't on the Mirage game, obviously, but aside from that, got pretty rocked and still overall comprehensively lost. And yet they get to cite top 4 on a massive international tournament for that. And yet you look at other teams with top 4s, they're coming from tournaments where you have to play tons of best of ones, or you have to play a best of 3 to get out, or you have to play a round of 8 match, or a round of 6 match if it's an IEM. This actually it shows that it's a weaker format in most senses, because what it aims to do, it doesn't even do as well as other tournaments. And so it's certainly not the worst format in any sense whatsoever. But I'm just giving it as an example of one where it would never has really been criticised as far as I can tell. There's never been any sort of outrage over it or anyone petitioning like, we've got to change this. And yet Blast Pro Series was utterly panned. People were saying it was the worst format and why would you ever do it? Now, first of all, the format is more than just the way they had 3 games shown at once. So that's a component of the format, but the format was this. There were 6 teams invited and they played a round robin best of 1 group stage. So each team plays 5 games, the other 5 teams, just one group. And each team plays at the same time as the other teams. You're all playing your matches at the same time, so that's another aspect of the format. It's not just that you play best of ones, but since you're playing your best of ones at the same time as the other guy, there's in theory, I mean, there would have been after day 1, after the first 2 rounds of games, 2 maps, there would have been chance to do a little bit of scouting on the opponent, but in theory you can't really be scouting the opponent because you're busy playing the game now, and even your analyst likely can't be scouting the opponent because he's probably watching your game to help pick up on tendencies of your opponent or yourself and help you improve the game. So that was certainly a component. And then a final detail, and this is the one that I noticed seemed to have been mentioned the least, but I actually thought was the best detail, was that they had pre-decided vetoes. These vetoes were done a couple of weeks in advance of the tournament. So teams came into this tournament, in theory, with time to prepare for weeks against a specific opponent on a specific map, knowing that is exactly who they would play them on in the group stage. And then there was only a final. Like, I know there was a standoff for the 3rd and 4th place, well, the 3rd place team and then the team they picked, but that wasn't obviously proper Counter-Strike. It was just aim maps. I don't really count that as part of the format, really. That was just almost like an exhibition, a show match to give them time to set up for the final, basically. So first of all, in terms of the pre-decided vetoes, I actually think this is a really good addition. I would like them to definitely keep this addition. I'd like some other tournaments actually to introduce it. In fact, personally, I think it would be amazing if you added this to the major, but maybe I should explain the reasons why, first of all. So first and foremost, by having pre-decided vetoes, you give people time to scout their opponent's tendencies and potentially prepare something specific for that opponent. Now, unfortunately, I will say this tournament itself wasn't a very good example of why that would be a very good format and the benefits of it, primarily because, first of all, the event came on the heels of IEM Oakland, where I think, let me think, was North actually there? I don't think North was there, but every other team was in attendance except NIP. No, NIP obviously were there. No, it's just North that weren't there then. Yes, every other team was in attendance at IEM Oakland. And so since 5 of the 6 teams were at IEM Oakland, teams like Astralis, if they'd had their real lineup, I think would have benefited from being able to scout the opponent. Possibly FaZe, if they'd have put in a little bit of work, because Carrigan does a lot of his stuff on the fly. I don't think he would have prepared much, but he might have had more tendencies on a certain map for an opponent. Beyond that, though, I actually think that as such, you didn't really, most of the teams really couldn't have actually put in the time to scout, and therefore you didn't get the big benefit of this. Because the reason why I like this format is this is one of the reasons why famously Korean StarCraft tournaments in StarCraft Brood War and in StarCraft 2 have been so overwhelmingly difficult to win. Basically the hardest tournaments to win, probably in esports history. Likewise, it applies in Korean League of Legends when you have the LCK and formerly OGN champions there, because once you get, obviously in that game you don't have maps, but you know the opponent already, and you know you're going to play them weeks in advance, and then even when you get into the playoffs, you have like a solid week where you're going to play someone in the next round of the playoffs. So you scout specifically for that opponent and put in so much prep that if you are the better team, it just increases even more so your chances of winning, with the caveat that some teams like to play freestyle, and so sometimes the better team doesn't get an advantage in that sense, but oftentimes the better teams are the teams that are better with more preparation, and if they prepare specific things, and therefore, as much as someone might think, oh, but it might give you a good chance to do an upset. Not unless you're a very tactical team and the other team isn't very tactical and can't adapt much. Generally, it's going to be the better teams that win as a result of this. So I like that as a format, not least because you know I'm not a fan, if you watch many of my videos and many of my format discussions, I'm not a fan of best of ones in the group stage, precisely because I think that it adds too much variance because you don't know what map you're going to play them on. And then when you get into it, you meet in the middle of the map pool, and then you have to play so many games in a row, you can't really prepare in the same way. So I thought that this actually counteracted a lot of those issues in a beneficial way. So that aspect I actually think is better than most of the tournaments, and I hope that they keep. I also think another factor that made it not as good, unfortunately, is that the dominant team in this tournament overall was actually Astralis. Like, they ended up losing less maps than anyone else in the tournament. But unfortunately, Astralis was in a position where, because they used not just a stand-in with Dennis replacing Device, but because Dennis actually took Dupree's spots and then Dupree took Device's spots, really it was like having 2 player changes with how it drastically altered Astralis' style, and Astralis clearly did not play their old system and style, so you couldn't really scout based on anything it did in the past. And then on top of that, I think actually, in a perverse way, it benefited them just in this one-off scenario where their star player was out, because essentially they only had to play these 2 maps, which were already agreed upon before teams knew that they'd change out Device. If teams had known they wouldn't have Device and then they'd done the vetoes, teams might have vetoed very differently, especially with the current system where we normally have a veto just before the match takes place. I think other teams would actually, after the first couple of games, having seen Astralis on Inferno and Overpass, said, fuck playing Inferno Overpass. We know they haven't had time to practice. Let's get them onto these other maps in the map pool with a normal veto, and they would have had to play more maps. Whereas in the group stage, they only played Overpass and Inferno and turned out to be very good on that. Whereas, for example, Inferno had actually been something of a shaky map for Astralis with the Device lineup. So I think Astralis, first of all, having this different lineup that you couldn't scout, and then doing so well that they ended up beating a bunch of these other teams, meant that there was less of an impact from this pre-decided veto aspect, which I do think is very good. Because in this scenario, Astralis could have been scouted, and or rather, Astralis had the chance potentially themselves to scout opponents, but couldn't be scouted themselves, really. Now, admittedly, they also couldn't do a whole lot with that scouting because they didn't have time to prep, so it wasn't that big of a like it wasn't like skewed it in Astralis' favor massively. But I do think that it meant that they should have been exposed in this scenario if they hadn't have had this format. But this is a very rare instance where a player last minute comes into a team who's never played with them, and then it causes 2 roster changes, and somehow they then do amazingly, and therefore it kind of messes up the benefits of this system. Now, I think another thing that's great about this system, but that you have to think about more than just in the isolation, is when you combine it with the point that you play at the same time as other teams' games, because it's not that you just get an overwhelming advantage from being able to prepare a specific map against an opponent. Because yes, you get to a lot more time to prepare, but you get less to no non-existent time to adapt to a game that a future opponent of yours played in the group already. Because, except as I said, if day one had gone the way it should have and the first two maps had been played for each teams, yes, you could have gone and watched those games and then adapted to the opponent you were playing in the first match, for example, the next day. But in this instance where you just played all 5 games in a row, essentially, because you were playing at the same time as those games took place, you could prepare in advance of those matches, but you couldn't really watch an opponent while they were playing their game and adapt to what they were doing there, or tweak something or get a read on them because of the fact you were playing at the same time. So you could say that's a negative. Yeah, in a way it is. I think not being able to adapt's not as good. Maybe if you give people a bigger break, or as we said here, they actually originally had planned to, essentially, by having the first 2 games and then the second 3. And the second part being the other 3 in the stadium. So I think it would have actually, again, evened out and to a net negative, like quite a large net negative, this predetermined veto, if the format had gone as planned and they hadn't have had the technical hiccups that meant they had to play all the games on day 2. So I don't think that would have been an issue overall. And finally, I think it would be sick for the major, because I actually don't want best of 1s in the major. I want best of 3 the whole way, and I want GSL system personally. Even if they use Swiss system, I'd like best of 3. But in a world in which we have to have best of 1s, whether that be, I mean, I guess you only know the first opponent for the Swiss system. Even so, I'd like it if you already predetermined the veto. I'd like it if you did it like this, like say 2 weeks out, not a month out, not 3 months out, not, obviously I want it to be reasonable, maybe a week out. That would be quite nice, because then people could put in so much prep for that first map that the better teams are much more likely to win the first map. And whether it be in a GSL system, I'd rather not use best of 1s there, but whatever, or let them do the vetoes for a series. I think it just would be cool, because for the major, it is the most important tournament. It's the one that people remember the most in your career, and especially the more casual the viewer is, the more likely they are to remember it. And it's so meaningful for people's careers, where I've seen time and time again the number 1 team in the world come into a major and not win the major, or a top 4 team come into the major and just bomb out in the group stage. I'd like to reduce some more variance and add in a better chance of those elite teams going deep at the biggest event by adding in this component. I think it would be cool. I think it would also make Counter-Strike very unique in that sense, in a way that other games aren't always. Now, although I guess you could make the point in something like League of Legends, while you don't know what champions they're going to pick in the draft, you know who you're playing in the group and you have weeks to prepare entirely for them. But that's not that dissimilar to when we had the GSL system anyway, right? It's just the Swiss system that makes the uncertainty. And funnily enough, some people say that some players say their favorite thing about the Swiss system is the uncertainty and not know who you're going to play. So, I mean, that's up to players to enjoy that. I'm not that big a fan of that myself, because I've seen without the reseeds, which, by the way, if you didn't have reseeds, would take away a lot of the uncertainty. It actually, I think it's a negative, the uncertainty, because it's like, oh, will they get an amazing team? Oh, they did. Fuck, well, that sucks. Now one of these teams more likely to go out. Now then, with the aspect of playing the 3 best of 1s at once, I will immediately say, and I said as much at the event, I don't think this is a great piece of the format. I think it's easily the weakest part of the format. I think it's easily the most criticisable, or for very reasonable, with very reasonable concerns. You can tie it into the fact that it offsets the advantage of the predetermined veto, and so maybe you can put it in as a balancing effect. Okay, I could see a case for that, but I will say this. This was probably the worst example that you could have seen of this type of a format, as in the 3 best of 1s being played at once. Because, first of all, there were 3. I think 3 is too many, because first of all, the good thing about having 2 is you can actually have 2 streams open. And first of all the action's not going to take place at once. It's easy enough to watch one, and then the rounds probably aren't going to be synced up, so you can watch part of one round, and then once that's fairly decided and someone's saving, you watch the other round, or this one's on an eco and I go watch the gun round here. I think you could actually make a more high-level experience watching 2 games at once like that than watching 3 at once. I think 3 is too many. I don't think it's really possible to follow 3 games at once unless you had just some ridiculous individual in terms of your ability to multitask, which, as far as I know, most humans are fairly bad at multitasking. Even when they seem to multitask, they're just really taking turns at doing one thing at a time, and it's somewhat serial. Now, with that said, say it was 2 streams at once, I could certainly see some positives for it. Like, first of all, I think the group stage of every tournament is the least interesting portion of the tournament. I care more about the playoffs. So, first of all, a positive here is we can we don't have to watch all the games in a row. Like, I don't have to go away for an hour if I don't want to watch this game. I can watch the other game. I think that's cool. It's got choice. If I want to watch both games, I can sort of manage it. Now, yes, every now and then with normal tournaments, you might get 2 games that you really want to watch both at the same time, and that would be distracting because you couldn't watch one fully. Okay, first of all, you can definitely go back and watch the VOD. Secondly, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think it would happen very rarely, which leads to another issue, which is I actually think that this would be a way smaller issue if it had been a big tournament like an EPL or an IEM Oakland, because there you have rubbish teams like Mongols or sometimes teams like Big or Hellraisers that I'm not a huge fan of. I don't really care about watching these teams, but if fans of them want to watch it, cool, they can watch it. And if that game's on and it's Big versus Hellraisers, I can go and watch G2 versus North or something like that and go, oh, cool, this is a way better game. So it would keep me more engaged with the event during the time it's live. I think that's a decent enough factor. Then you've got to add in that by playing all these games at once, you cut down on time constraints for the event because you need less days to play out your group stage. And therefore, first of all, as I said before, I think the group stage is less interesting. So I already think it sucks where the group stage can be like half of a tournament or sometimes 3/4 of a tournament, depending on the format. And then the best part, the playoff series, sometimes are loaded up. So it's like one and then, sometimes you have semi-finals and final on the same day. So I think that's criminal. I'd much rather give up group stage games in terms of being able to watch them all live. Therefore, by cutting down on the time constraints, you need less days in a stadium or less days with an event. It cuts the costs for the tournament, possibly. Obviously, you need more machines. And finally, I would just say, this has actually been an approach I've seen, especially applied in Dota pretty heavily. Like, I've noticed in some of the Dota tournaments where they play out group stages and sometimes it doesn't eliminate you, even if you come last in your group, you just go to a lower bracket. That's one of the reasons they can get away with doing double elimination tournaments, because they're cutting down the number of games by showing numerous games at once in the group stage where it's less important and less of the people are on board watching the games anyway. So I think it makes more sense to cut time at that point in the tournament. I can definitely understand why some people don't appreciate it. As I said, though, in a tournament that has lesser teams, especially the ones that have the odd bad team in it, it would be way better to be able to skip, which, by the way, is the sports style. In sports, you follow your team and perhaps the marquee game. Unless you're a massive fan of football, NFL, NBA, NHL, you don't watch every game. You couldn't watch every game logistically anyway, and there's too many teams. So this way, you follow your team or you follow the big game, and that's about it. I think that's a better way to follow the Counter-Strike tournaments, by the way. Anyone who says that they're getting burned out, I would just go ahead and ask yourself, are you watching all the EPL games? Are you watching all these small tournaments? Are you watching every game at a big LAN? That's part of why you're getting burned out. If you want to really enjoy tournaments, figure out what types of games and teams you really enjoy watching, start only watching them, and then gradually expand out. Watch the ones that are a bit more questionable, or watch them to inform yourself, or go back and watch a VOD later once a team becomes good. Like, say, Renegades now has become somewhat of an interesting team. Now go back and watch the games from the Star Ladder Shanghai Invitational, where you weren't really following the tournament, you were figuring VP was just going to win, but now you saw they won, and was it a fluke? Now go back and watch it. Now you got a good reason to. So I think it's a decent enough prospect in that sense. I think part of the problem of this tournament is they had 6 of the top 7 teams in the world. I think basically you'd probably have to make a decent case Cloud9 is better than some of these teams, or should be ranked better at the moment. But they had 6 of the top 7 teams in the entire world of Counter-Strike. So as a result, having 3 games at once meant that every game was one that, in theory, if you're a hardcore fan, you probably want to watch. So having 3 at once, which you can't really fault 3 at once, yeah, I can get it. That's a problem. Another reason why I don't mind having this format, if you had 2 at once, for example, is I generally don't like best of ones anyway. So to me, the pre-planned element already made it superior to IEMs and EPLs, which are other best of one tournaments. I don't really want to have 2 or 3 days to play out groups that are best of ones like some of the aforementioned tournaments. So I think it's actually a positive to have a shorter tournament in that sense, even though I agree for people like want to watch it live, not me necessarily, it's not as good. Now, in terms of should they keep this format, I would say first and foremost, yes, definitely keep the predetermined part. I think that's a really cool feature. It's very unique. In terms of doing the games at once, I would say go to 2 at once. And I would also say it should be dependent on who is attending the event. Like, if you end up having one of these events, they've said they're going to have them around the world. If you end up having one of these events and it's a lot of tier 2 teams, go with 2 or 3 games at once. If you have a tournament like this again with 6 teams, I think 2 is the most you can do. And actually, if you can get more days in a stadium, maybe consider just going to 1 game at a time and not doing the 2, because you're going to get a lot more complaints from people who want to watch both games, and they won't all necessarily be unjustified. Then you've got to add in, I think it's good for marketing and branding, some of these components, because they are unique. No other tournament has them. There are a lot of tournaments that are the same that just copy other formats. Now, yes, some of them copy formats because they're better, but some of them, for example, IEM, EPL, I think actually do the formats that are inferior to things like GSL and Swiss System. But I will say, it makes it exciting. It adds a different variety. It adds some spice to the tournament calendar. So in the same sense, I don't have a problem with someone like Blast using this kind of a format again. I also think the fact it keeps down costs is an argument that's hard to really make a case against. Because if a tournament organizer can keep down costs, like they would have only had one day in a stadium here, they can then sell out the stadium. They can then put in more of the money into making the theatricality and the big pyrotechnics and making a cool show and having proper intros and stuff. I think that that would be a pretty cool way to go. And I also think we've got too many events that are 6 or 7 days long. And by the way, when I say that, I am directly hurting my wallet if that affects the industry, because when it's a 6 or 7 day event, I get paid my day rate for 6 or 7 days. So there's a lot of casters out there who are like, sure, Ixnay on the event, you know, but I will go ahead and say it, except for stuff like majors and really important tournaments. I would rather there were 2 or 3 day tournaments now. I think some of them last way too long. We've got too many 6 or 7 day tournaments, quite frankly, especially once you go further down the ranks of how important the tournaments are. I would go ahead and say, though, that this format had its own positives. It was a unique format. Is it the best format? No. Some elements of it are the best format, though. And it has some components I could see being applied to other formats, which I think would be superior. And so I wouldn't be as quick to write off the whole thing, especially not to present it as though it's just the 3 best of ones. I thought it had its own charm to it.
Hey, I'm Hiko, the master baiter, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.